question I have here is, does the screen come down?
It does.
Okay.
It doesn't.
And I have to make sure that I don't talk too long because I'll talk way too much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here today. I've had the chance to speak in front of most Rotary clubs in Pierce County, and I've not been in front of Sunrise and not been in front of my home club at Rotary 8, so this is quite an honor to actually be here today and be with you. I appreciate it. And I do have to shout out to my fellow Lutes, Sean, there. I don't actually get to often shout out to fellow Lutes. I just don't see enough Lutes around.
First East!
There's lots here. Look at this. Excellent. Excellent. Good. Good. Yeah, I live over by UPS, so I have to keep the bumper stickers hidden and all that. Well, I wanted to today really talk more generally about the issue of disabilities. And, of course, we'll probably give ourselves a shameless plug at some point here for TACID. But really, what I wanted to do is to kind of frame it in the context of Rotary and some of the things that go on here. I think that one of the things that we forget oftentimes as Rotarians is that the signature thing that we work on internationally, and we're almost there, right? We're almost there, and it started in the Philippines, was this whole idea of eradicating polio. And we're in the business of eliminating the cause of one of the world's major disabilities that's out there, and just down to 3 countries at this point. It's amazing work, and I think that we oftentimes forget that that's some of what we're working on. There's the inoculation, there's all the work that goes on out there in the community, but forgetting about what had actually happened. I think many of the people who are in the audience here have lived with people who've had polio and the effects of it and have seen that. But for many of us who are younger, we haven't really lived with that scourge in our own community in a way that was really visible. For me, it didn't really. I've known people who were adults who had polio as youth, but coming to TACID, one of the interesting things for me was that we work across all disabilities. We were formed as an organization by people with disabilities, for people with disabilities, and it was mental health, deafness, blindness, and multiple sclerosis were the 4 sort of disability groups that got together to form TACID. But since that time, there are a number of different support groups that meet, and post-polio is one of the support groups in our community that meets, and it's a very strong group, and it's a very important group in our club. And again, it's something that I like to share with Rotarians, that the effects of polio are certainly still out there, even though we're working on the issue of making sure that it goes away and that it doesn't come back, that there are still people that live with the effects of it. Many people don't realize that often if you have polio and survive it, that some of the effects of it can come back again later in life. And so a lot of people do live with that, and it's a thing that they address for a long time. The other thing that I think is important to understand, we all get together as Rotarians because we enjoy the fellowship of each other. We share common values, our belief in the 4-way test, our belief in understanding and commonality of wanting to make a better community, to network, to create stronger businesses, and good leadership in our communities. And one of the things that our organization does that I think people often ask me, well, we think you do something good, but we really don't know what you do. What do you do there at TACID? And I frankly didn't know that either, really, until I started working there, and I'm kind of ashamed of it, but I actually tried. My mom lived with MS for 20 years before she passed away in 2007. And what I realize now working at TACID is that was a resource that we could have used. I tried in the community to find resources, and it never really came up. And that's been one of my pledges, is to work to make sure that for people who have family members, relatives, or know people with disabilities, that they understand more about what TACID does and what some of the opportunities are to participate there. The big thing that goes on is peer support. And it's one of these things that might seem really touchy-feely or sort of squishy or soft sciencey. But what's the value of peer support? Well, you all know the value of peer support. You get together every week. You share in this fellowship. And in doing this, you learn from each other. You understand how to be better leaders in the community, how to do business with each other. All these things that happen when you get together as Rotarians are the same things that happen in peer support when people with disabilities get together. And what I wanted to share were a couple different things here. Where I want to go with this today is that you'll have a better understanding of some of the issues. I want you to convince you that to consider different ways that you can personally improve accessibility in the community, and that you have a resource where you can turn when you have questions. We'll come back around to that kind of question I was posing there. One of the things that we tend to work on is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I'm not going to go into a whole lecture here around this stuff. But we believe that all people have the same basic needs, that they have physiological needs. So, we need shelter, we need clothing, we need some of those basic sorts of things. We need to be safe. We need to be in community around people. We need to feel good about ourselves. And ultimately, when all of these things add up, we can be the best person that we can. We can self-actualize and go out there in the community and do that. Well, in the world of disabilities, that is something that can be a little bit more difficult, because there's a lot of stuff tied in with disabilities. Stigma, especially around mental health. That's one of the ones that we wrestle with a lot in every community, because it's not something that you can really pigeonhole. It's not, there's a cane or a wheelchair, or someone needs an interpreter for sign language. That's someone doesn't quite seem right. There's something not there. Or it could be that they're hearing voices, or that they're really happy one day and really depressed another day going on. And what ends up happening is that we start looking at people as what their disability is, and we stop seeing the human that's there, and we start seeing what the thing is that is sort of obvious for them. So that's kind of a medical model. And what we tend to work on is what's known as an independent living model. The medical model is valid. People need to get their medical needs taken care of. But you might see a doctor once every 6 months, once a year. People with disabilities don't necessarily see doctors any more frequently than anyone else does. And so what happens in between? You still have these functional needs to be able to get by in the community. And because of things like stigma or community barriers, it becomes difficult for people with disabilities who kind of live on the outside of the middle point of the bell curve to be able to get by in the community. And so what we tend to do is to work with people to help build back up. After a while of being treated like your disability, many people, and I see this every day, it's sad, they begin to stop believing in themselves. They start to just begin to think that they're about the disability itself, that the sort of essence of humanity starts to get stripped away. And I think many of us see this with older parents that we might be taking care of. It's making sure that they're safe, making sure that they get to the doctor and the right pills at the right time, and all these sorts of things. And it gets difficult to really see through that whole thing. What ends up happening with people is that they also start, or stop, thinking about that way, and they stop believing in their own capacity to move forward. And so instead of the community necessarily telling them that they're somehow less worthy, they begin to tell themselves that they're somehow less worthy. But what we do is we work with people to help rebuild that self-esteem and that connection to other people and that sense of self-worth so that they can move forward. The majority of people with disabilities are people in between the ages of 21 and 64. And this is one of the real challenges out in the community, is that as communities we tend to want to fund things for youth and we tend to want to fund things for seniors, but in the arena of people with disabilities, it's really that large audience in the middle of the 21 to 64-year-olds where a lot of the community costs start coming into play. Costs of homelessness, high use of emergency services, hospitalization, emergency rooms, sometimes incarceration. All of those things are very expensive services, and those mostly happen not with youth and not with seniors, but in that middle population. So what we're trying to do is not only help the individual with disabilities, but we're also working on how to reduce community costs as well. There's some major issues that are facing people with disabilities. There are similar issues that are facing other people. Opportunities for work, access to medical care, in particular access to usable and affordable transportation, access to affordable housing. Without getting into the politics of it, transportation is something that is weighing on people's minds very, very heavily right now with the constituents that we work with. And just as an example of the dependence on it, for example, imagine if you're dependent on public transportation to get around, and imagine you have a job, and that job may be a few days a week and you really struggle to get to it. It happens to be a custodian job, it happens to be a dishwasher job, and it happens to be on the weekend, and you need public transportation. One of the challenges that we have is public transportation is coming backwards on us, people who are absolutely dependent on it have the risk of actually losing those jobs because of the inability to get the transportation. So that's a very precise reality. The last go-around with the cuts in transportation that happened here, we actually in our organization saw a 12% reduction in the shuttle visits from people who were using our services that aren't using our services anymore because they simply can't get to the services. It's not necessarily that we can go out and deliver those services. We've seen at the transit center at TCC a 9% reduction in the ridership over there. We've seen corresponding reductions in the attendance of people with disabilities in our services. So the effects of this stuff are very real for people. And being able to get to and from places independently is one of the core things to getting all kinds of other things done for people. I mean, imagine, most of us probably drive cars here. Imagine if we didn't have that and now had to sort of deal with a different way of doing it. It wouldn't be that simple to get around. So the disabilities landscape in our community, the numbers, I believe, in the end are probably larger than this, but the reported numbers are just over 14% of the community are people with disabilities. So in Pierce County, that's about 112,000. In the city of Tacoma, it's about 28,000 people. The majority, again, are 18 to 64. I think I said 21 to 64 earlier. There's a couple different studies that show different ways, but generally that's the kind of the bubble population. There's a 19% poverty rate for people with disabilities. And you can go down the list here and see these things. They're less likely to graduate from high school or college. They have lower average incomes, food insecurity, which means access to food, poor nutrition, those sorts of things. And if you start looking at all these things compounding each other, you see how it starts adding up in here. 65% unemployment rate is incredible. For people with serious mental illness, it's a 90% unemployment rate. And that's a number that comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration of the federal government. 90% unemployment rate. I work with people every day. We have about a third of the people that we serve, close to 4,000 people a year. And about a third of them are people with serious mental illness disabilities, the kind of stuff that you don't see on a day-to-day basis. You might be walking down the street and you never know. Basically, 1 in 4 people have mental illness at some point in their life. I always kind of joke around, it's like look around the room, count how many are here out of a room of 100. It's something that people live with. It's a brain disability. It's not something that people want to do or choose to do. And again, if we go back to that hierarchy of needs, people want the same things. People want to work. People want to contribute. They want to, be in charge of their own lives. And if you have a 90% unemployment rate, when you can't have supports that help keep you successful in the community, it becomes very discouraging and it becomes very costly to the community. Imagine any population having that kind of rate of unemployment. And the ADA considers people with disabilities as a group, as a minority. Federal government considers people with disabilities as a minority. So what that means is that people with disabilities are actually the de facto largest minority in the country. So it's a pretty large block of people. People with disabilities are more likely to be isolated from social and community activities. They have lower levels of social and emotional support, lower health quality of life. And one thing that I was really struck by was about 40% of people with disabilities in this report that the University of Washington prepared, which is where some of this data is coming from, 40% said they had fears and concerns when they were out in the community about their safety. Some of that just comes from how we treat people when we come across them. And this is my challenge to Rotarians, is we're the leaders in the community. We're the people who are, as a signature issue, are working on eliminating a disability. We're the ones who can convince the rest of the community to eliminate and reduce stigma. Meaning basically, look at people as people, treat people as who they are, as a fellow human being and not the thing that might scare us, frankly. And I keep coming back to mental illness, because the thing we read in the paper around mental illness disability is the person who committed some violence or some scary thing that was out there. And that just, that has to do with the facts of what makes news. News itself is the unusual. And so when that happens, that's an unusual thing. The reality of mental illness disability for most people is that they get by just fine in their lives, but they do have some needs for accommodation. So oftentimes just simply flexible schedules for what can help people be able to work. Violence in the mental illness community is really no more than in the general population statistically, but it's the thing that you do end up seeing in the papers about frequently. People with mental illness disability, frankly, are more likely to harm themselves than they are someone else. So I do like to remind people of that. I'm not going to go down this whole list here, but some things that you can see that are kind of important in the realm of disabilities. Dorothea Dix, some people may be familiar with that name. She actually began to be concerned with who were the people who were in poorhouses and who were the people in jails, and started working actively to try to get people out who didn't belong. And that was back as early as 1841. Pretty close to that in 1848, we actually see the first institutionalization, the first institution for people with developmental disabilities created. And this is a tricky thing, because on the one hand, you want to have people taken care of and take care of them properly, but on the other hand, if they don't need to be in institutions, you don't want to have them be there, because that prevents them from leading lives that are independent. I work with a number of people who you probably at first blush would really consider, again, the kind of the community phrases that come up are, not intelligent, not aware, they don't read, all these sorts of things. But if you actually sit down and talk with them, they may not read, they may not have gone to the same kind of a school, but if you really get to know what they're doing and present them the options, they can make very, very good decisions, very precise decisions with good judgment if they have the right accommodation. And so that independent living idea of having people out in the community is very important. A person who's on our board of directors and has been our vice chair has been a person who cannot read, can't read a spreadsheet, but what we do is we read to him and give him that information, and his judgments are as precise and on target as any other board member that we have. So, and he sees the world in a different way, so we actually get some added value that comes in from that. But that institutionalization was important, because as we go down, we start seeing it's really not until the 20th century that the federal government starts jumping in with things like the Social Security Act. And we as an organization don't necessarily believe that entitlements, quote unquote, are the right way to go, or that it's government's responsibility to take care of people. We think there's a role in that, but frankly, I feel very strongly that it's our responsibility as community members to take care of our families, our neighbors, our friends, that we in community, if we entrust it out there too far, we start getting into these things like institutionalization and bureaucracy and all that, and that never helps anyone. So what we try to do is to bring it in as close as possible. There are some civil rights issues attached to this, and so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became very important for people with disabilities. In 1972, the Center for Independent Living was formed at Berkeley. It's by a couple students who had got in the 60s and were basically fighting to get into the school. They were turned down to get into the school. Their thing with disabilities was just using wheelchairs, but they weren't allowed in. They started fighting for this, and it became a movement that ultimately is part of what TACID was a part of in 1980. This whole idea of centers for independent living and moving out of the medical model became really important for people. And in 1979, Washington State had Referendum 37, some of you may remember that. And what that did was that provided, I believe, $25 million statewide to build buildings that focused on care, training, and rehabilitation of people with disabilities. TACID was one of those centers that came about because of that. And we've been operating, the doors actually opened in 1984, we've been operating since 1980 and have served more than 50,000 people since that time. So it's kind of a big issue. Not many people are aware of this, but that sign that's on Interstate 5, the All-American City Award, that's over there, there were 2 projects submitted. The Tacoma Dome was submitted, and nothing happened with that. TACID was then submitted, and that's the thing that got Tacoma the All-American City Award, was that project where the community came together in the spirit of helping each other. And so I do try to keep that alive a little bit, because you drive by that sign and it's kind of like, well, what is that? Well, that's where that came from. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was adopted. I put ADAPT in here. This is a fascinating organization. Some people may remember this. Is there's a group of people who basically went to the Capitol and were using wheelchairs and basically put themselves out of their wheelchairs onto the Capitol steps and climbed up the Capitol steps to make the point that the Capitol building itself was not accessible. And that's one of the things by this organization, ADAPT, which is kind of the militant wing of the disabilities movement. They're still out there today doing stuff on Medicaid right now. That they had basically helped to put into play the thing that got the community generally looking at this and saying, this is just not right. This is not right when people are doing this. As it turns out, there was a woman from Lakewood who was at the signing ceremony in 1990 with President Bush. It was a pivotal part of getting the ADA moving forward because she was actually denied access to a movie theater here. And the reason that the access was denied was that her wheelchair was seen as dangerous to other people, that somehow she was going to block people if there were a fire or an emergency, and so she was prevented from going into the theater. President Bush invited her to the signing ceremony, and basically at that point used the phrase, "Let the shameful walls of discrimination come down" at this point. So there's a lot of credit that goes out there for making that happen. Finally, in 1999, the Olmstead decision came forward, and that was something that broke down the institutionalization. The Supreme Court in Georgia, or the Supreme Court of the United States, basically told the state of Georgia that you can't keep people institutionalized if they don't have to be institutionalized. You need to find ways to get people out in the community and let them lead independent lives. So what we do at TACID is we focus on 3 different things. We focus on peer support, so that's really facilitating getting groups of people together with different disabilities to share their experiences with each other. You can have a doctor tell you which end is up and what to do, which pills to take, and what therapies to do, but the reality is that between those visits, if you work with other people who have shared the same experience with you, you're able to then move forward and learn from their experience and be able to successfully advance in the community. So that's why peer support is such an important thing. Advocacy, self-advocacy and public policy advocacy, for example, transportation is a big issue for us right now. Self-advocacy is hugely important. Showing people how they can be better advocates for themselves in the community is a huge part of what we do. And then self-sufficiency programs. We work on helping people with disabilities become skilled at obtaining and retaining jobs, at successfully living in housing, as well as wellness. So again, the benefit of this is that ultimately we're helping the individual improve and be independent, but at the same time we're helping to reduce community costs. Permanent supportive housing that we provide for people with disabilities, for example, saves the community 36% in cost. It translates into hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So in that vein, it's really important that there are organizations like ours, and we're just one of many around there. In Lakewood, there's the Center for Independence that works on independent living issues. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is to help level the playing field for people who have disabilities to make sure that they can do what they want to do, which is to be productive, to earn their own way, and to give back to society. I hear that every day. We have 14,000 hours of volunteer time being contributed in our organization and others. And the main reason why is you've done so much for us, we want to give back. That's a central value of the people that we work with, and frankly, I think it's a central value of most people. We just want to be able to give back. We want to carry a load, and we want to give back. So with that being said, I wanted to stop here. I've probably gone a little bit over, but am I fine? Okay. That's what I was hoping to do, is to see if there's any questions or comments. I'm kind of curious how people maybe have run into disabilities issues, particularly from the business community. One of the things that we look at is how can we help the business community be not simply hire people with disabilities, but when you look at that 14.3% of people in the community have disabilities, that's a very large block of people who are consumers too. And so what I put out there into the business community is thinking about what are ways that you can be disability friendly. And of course that's a big question because disabilities are a whole gamut. But I'm wondering if anyone has any questions or comments about how you've interfaced with disabilities or concerns about disability issues generally. You can kind of pick any realm that you can think of. Okay, sounds good.
Well, some of my students would like to take that sign language course and they don't know how to find information about it. So you do offer classes?
Yeah, we have Christine Seymour is the person who is running a sign language class right now. And actually, she didn't have enough to start a beginner class, and I think it's $60 for 8 weeks is what she's charging on that. She used to work with the Hearing, Speech, and Deafness Center, and is also highly involved with emergency management on the high-risk populations.
So
but
just call the office?
yeah, and if there's enough interest, we can talk to her about seeing how to put together a class. I think we need like 8 or so people to be able to do that.